If you're with us already, we'll be starting the event in just a few minutes, so just sit tight. Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you're all well and safe in this difficult time. My name is Shobhan Deer. I'm the Vice President of Oxford Climate Society and I'm a PhD student at Oxford working to develop sustainable batteries to support renewables. So for those who don't know about Oxford Climate Society, we're a student-led society at Oxford University aiming to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders. We're, in addition to our speaker events, such as tonight, we run educational programs throughout the year, including our award-winning School of Climate Change, which is now teaching over 1,400 people from all over the world in this term school alone. We also run the world's largest student-run climate journal, Anthroposphere, and we're running a Decarbonise Oxford campaign this term. We're also working with the university to develop net zero policies and to incorporate climate on the Oxford curriculum. So the theme of today's event is what is the role of civil disobedience in the climate movement? Despite the years of overwhelming evidence for human-driven climate change and its risks, governments all over the world have failed time and time again to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with scientific recommendations. The world is not even close to being on track to 2 degrees to below 2 degrees of warming, the threshold agreed in the 2015 Paris Agreement, beyond which the consequences of climate change become much more severe. So civil disobedience, one of the definitions is a public, non-violent and conscientious breach of law undertaken with the aim of bringing about a change in laws or government policies. It is associated with many of the most successful social movements in modern history, for instance, the women's suffragette movement, Mahatma Gandhi's movement for Indian independence, and the civil rights movement. Therefore, given the insufficient action taken by governments around the world on climate, is civil disobedience now a necessary tool in the climate movement? And if so, what kind of civil disobedience would be effective given its global nature? Finally, what lessons can be learned from the successful and indeed unsuccessful uses of civil disobedience and social movements of the past? To provide some insight into these questions, we're delighted to be joined by 2 experts in civil disobedience and climate movements, Professor Patrick Bond and Professor James Jasper. Professor Patrick Bond is professor at the University of Western Cape School of Government in Cape Town. In the past, he worked at the US Federal Reserve Bank. He served urban social movements working on financial justice based at the NGO Plan Act in Johannesburg. And he worked in the Reconstruction and Development Ministry in President Nelson Mandela's office. His best known work is Elite Transition from Apartheid to Neoliberalism in South Africa. And he's been part of other critical analysis, including his books on politics of climate justice, Against Global Apartheid, and Talk Left, Walk Right. James Jasper is a sociologist of social movements whose work is focused on politics and culture, especially the cultural and emotional dimensions of protest movements. Jasper taught at New York University and is a visiting professor at Columbia Princeton and the New School of Social Research. Since the fall of 2007, he has been affiliated with the Sociology PhD program at the Graduate Center of the City of University of New York. And he also founded the Politics and Protest Workshop there. He's authored, co-authored, and edited numerous books, including The Art of Moral Protest, Restless Nation, and Rethinking Social Movements. So we're going to start this event with each of the speakers giving a short speech with their thoughts on the topic, followed by some questions from myself before opening it up to questions from you, the audience, at the end. So if you have any questions for our speakers, please write them in the live stream chat on the right-hand side. So thank you so much, Patrick and James, for joining us today. So to start, James, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Well, good evening, and thanks for having me. I'll start with something I think we can all agree about, which is that movements to address the climate crisis should be a lot larger than they are. So I want to ask why they aren't larger and what we can do about that, and whether civil disobedience can help expand the movements. So let me start with the emotions of protest. Since collective action, all political action, well, all human action, is motivated by, shaped by, aimed at, and worked out through emotions. To simplify a little bit, the duration of an emotion varies quite a lot, from sort of paradigmatic, quick, immediate reactions to things that happen to us, all the way up through very stable, sometimes lifelong commitments, such as love for our group or of a place, pride that we have, compassion that we have for people, other species, and so on. So these long-term orientations can be attached to particular things, as I said, groups, places, or they can attach to moral intuitions and principles. And in fact, I think that what we talk about when we talk about morality, we're really talking about emotions. And we may get back to that a little bit later. So if we think about these long-run emotions as basic orientations, then we can see very quickly that they help define rationality. They help define our lives. We couldn't be rational without emotions, and that's why they are so important. The old idea that emotions and rationality are somehow at odds with each other doesn't really hold up very well. So what social movements typically do is to try to take these short-run emotions, either to build on or to trigger new ones, short-run emotions that can then help them inform or reinforce our long-run commitments. So, for example, the shock of seeing George Floyd slowly murdered on video is used to teach and to develop a more general racial justice commitment, using a lot of ideological elaboration on the basis of these emotions, but still containing emotions of indignation, of compassion, of solidarity, and a distaste for traditional police tactics. So the first step toward protest is this: when something horrible happens, how do we explain it? What or whom do we blame? Most of all, do we frame an event as an act of God or an act of nature, which is to say that it's outside of human control, that it's an accident? Or do we frame it as the result of human choices, human policies, intentions? The boundary between the two is not always tidy, and in fact, the intention of protest is often to shift that boundary, especially to make our governments feel responsible for certain outcomes, outcomes that perhaps we used to think were just part of the natural order, just the way things are. And even if we don't think the state has caused a problem, we can still hold it responsible in another sense of the word, which is that they're responsible for fixing it, or perhaps for predicting and protecting us in the case of a lot of weather disasters. So blame is typically attached to a simple story, complete with characters. Foremost, we need to be able to identify victims, people we feel sorry for, people we need to help in some way. But we also need to identify villains, someone to blame, someone to stop, someone to hate, possibly. Sometimes in these stories, there are also heroes, although surprisingly, these are less important, I think, than the victims and the villains. This is a big challenge for the climate crisis movement. There are plenty of horrific events, outcomes, victims galore, but how do we attribute these events to human activity? The link from cause to outcome is much less direct than we see in, for example, the George Floyd video, where the villains literally have their hands and knees on the victim that we see. Climate disasters are usually separated in time and space from the activities that helped cause them. The villains and the victims don't even necessarily meet. It's a problem, I think, rhetorically for setting up the shocks that we need to get blame and indignation. Indignation being the key emotion for protest. A second problem is disasters from climate crisis look like events that in the past we have always attributed to nature and God. Fires, floods, droughts, famine. These are biblical inflictions that go way back. And in fact, random acts of nature still cause some of them, even if they are made more frequent, more devastating by the current climate crisis. The shock of these events produces pity for the suffering of others, but it does not always provoke outrage, indignation at the perpetrator. Because the trick of blame is that you need villains as well as victims. Again, with George Floyd, you had clear perpetrators and one cop in particular caught in the act on video. That's in a way, the reason the protests last spring and summer were so strong, so immediate, was that we had an image, a video that's in a way the gold standard of provoking indignation for a protest. With the climate crisis, the perpetrators are, in a way, us. It's hard always to define villains who are neatly others. We do some work of demonization, of focusing blame. We point to corporations that pollute, but most of these corporations are generating our electricity, building the buses we take to work, printing the books that we read, or the tablets we increasingly read the books on instead. So a great deal of environmentalism has focused on what we can do as individuals, but all the recycling, all the trips by public transportation in the world are not going to be enough. And only then come the hard things. Leading environmental advocates can't seem to resist flying around the world to give talks. The impact of manufacturing an electric vehicle is enormous. To see how hard it gets, think of the one thing above all else that an individual can do to help the climate crisis: refuse to have children. For most people, that's very hard. The feelings you have for your children are qualitatively different from anything else you ever feel. So the proof of how hard it is to forgo children is when you read books about the climate crisis, almost all the authors mention their children. Their children are their reason for caring so much about the future. They hope that their daughter or son may someday invent climate-saving technologies. Now, there's a little bit of bad faith here among very well-intentioned people. If they can't pull it off, who can? It's a challenge, I think. Anyway, so how are we ever going to find the right villains to blame in the great drama of climate crisis? That's the real challenge for civil disobedience. The main impact of which is to bring attention to problems, to find the right symbols to stick in people's minds, to fix indignation against relevant, salient villains. Sometimes you get both. Sometimes you can stop something directly and get symbolic ammunition. One of the most successful examples of civil disobedience were the animal liberationists of the 1980s and 90s, who broke into labs and not only brought attention to, by breaking in, but they found in those labs simply horrifying videos of cute animals, kittens, puppies, monkeys, in restraints that really made it look as though the scientists were torturing them. And in some cases, they found videos of scientists mocking the animals, joking about them. It was powerful, powerful stuff. These were perfect victims. And then you saw them with the villains in a lot of these videos. So I think the climate change movement has to figure out who the most effective targets are. Obviously, someone who emits the most carbon or a lot of carbon, people or corporations, entities whose activities could be changed the most easily, but also you need to find targets who illuminate and symbolize the blame most readily, dramatically, where you're going to get the maximum indignation because you combine the villains with sympathetic victims. So with target selection, we mostly are, through civil disobedience, trying to reach third-party audiences, the general public. But we also may hope to shame the villains themselves into reform, not necessarily because they do a lot of soul searching, realize the error of their ways, but at least because others put pressure on them. But this shaming can backfire, especially when someone believes that they're being shamed unfairly. Then, instead of feeling shame, they feel indignation, anger, they fight back, they counter-mobilize. And in a lot of social movements, a lot of cases of protest, the counter movement often proves stronger than the original protest movement. It's something that backlash is something it would be great to avoid. Sometimes there is group pride involved, and shame orchestrated by outsiders can seem like interference. This is especially a problem when groups in wealthy nations seem to be shaming people in less developed nations. In these cases, a kind of self-defeating nationalist backlash is almost inevitable. So you could go protest at the Brazilian embassy over the burning of the Amazon rainforest, but this would play very poorly in Brazil. So in essence, you have to find your own pairings of villains and victims to trigger what I call a moral battery, combining positive and negative charges, good things and bad things, pushing people away from the bad and drawn toward the utopian good. And I think this is hard for the climate change movement. You know better than I do who the big carbon emitters are. I hope to have suggested some ways to think about the selection of targets in civil disobedience campaigns. Catch them in the act. Make it visible and clear and simple what's going on. Find villains who look and act the part, who are already disliked. Corporations are a very likely target here, especially the bigger big bad international corporations, but also try to find very specific victims who can arouse compassion, rather than simply pointing out that all humans, all life on the planet are victims. We're all victims. You need very specific, memorable victims who will stick in people's minds. We are all victims, of course, but finding the right villains is one step toward turning us all into heroes who battle the villains, who make sacrifices, who fight hard, but usually, at least in the fairy tales, win in the end. Thanks.
Thank you, James. That was absolutely fascinating, and I really find that point about how the victims and the kind of heroes kind of never, or the victims and the oppressors never meet in the climate movement is a really interesting one. So yeah, thank you very much for that. Patrick, over to you.
It's great to be with you, and in a moment I'm going to beg your tolerance. I'll share screen and show you some photos because it's a little dark here, and if you could see, there's Robben Island in the background, where one of our greatest, many greatest liberation heroes tried civil disobedience and then moved to armed struggle. And I'm talking of Nelson Mandela, who spent a couple of decades there and another 7 years elsewhere. So we've had also in this city of Cape Town, Mahatma Gandhi appealing to the old authorities in 1913, failing and developing as a result Satyagraha, the truth force. And Shoban, thanks for having me, and thanks for bringing a bit of South Africa, because I've been watching the global movement and I've been frustrated that you've managed, particularly with Extinction Rebellion, or if you're in Germany now, Indica Lenda, if you're in the US, Dakota Access Pipeline, and numerous cases which I won't have time to delve into, but you've already taken the lead in setting out these matters. Nevertheless, what exactly James put forward is what I'd like to now turn to, which is partly the question of strategies and tactics, but in a way, first of all, it's what he put forward as the central challenge. That is identifying your ideology, so you know where your victims and villains, your critique comes from. So let me quickly start by reminding you, we've got a terrific role model who spoke at the World Economic Forum last month and did exactly what James asked, which was to blame the villains right to their face, for creating new loopholes and failing to connect the dots and building so-called pledges. But basically, the dilemma is the level of public awareness continues to be so low. Our leaders get away with almost anything, right? And packaging and selling their message wins. So everything James said, absolutely correct. So the way I like to put this is to set up 5 categories that the movements will typically work on. Implicitly, they have it, even if explicitly it's not always there. The principles which guide them, the analyses, the strategies, tactics, and alliances. A lot of great civil disobedience and activism is occurring in what we could call climate action ideology. But I'd rather remind you that there's a climate justice tradition. I think many correlations between climate justice and environmental justice, going back to the 1980s in places like North Carolina, right, where Robert Bullard wrote about dumping in Dixie and the correlation of race and pollution. In Cochabamba, after the failed Copenhagen United Nations Climate Summit, very big ambitions were set out that helped to distinguish what is climate justice and what is climate action. So there's obviously some ambitions that were far too grandiose, but here are some principles that have been dropped that I want to raise, because it's exactly what Greta Thunberg says. The elites are using loopholes and accounting gimmicks and failing, for example, to acknowledge climate debt. Estimates of $10 trillion were just published last year in Nature. You can go into the details. Full respect for indigenous people and human rights and Mother Earth rights, an international court of climate justice. The rejection of the commodification of this process, the privatization of the air, reducing emissions through deforestation, forest degradation, or clean development mechanisms, but especially the sort of renewal of net zero ideology. promoting change in the North's consumption patterns, the end of intellectual property rights, which is, by the way, for the COVID-19 vaccine, South Africa with India and Kenya and Swaziland have put forward a proposal to get rid of intellectual property on the vaccines and on the treatments. So just watch that space. It's February 23rd in Geneva. Here are 3 books, if some of you are scholars and activists, and of course, actually in my classes when I was at Oxford under David Harvey's supervision in the late 80s, we kind of put them together to find a praxis epistemology where activists like Nemo Bassi, a great Nigerian from the nonviolent civil disobedience tradition that I'm sure some of you have heard of, Ken Saro-Wiwa's movement for the emancipation of the Ogoni people against Shell Oil. And he was not, in a sense, immediately a climate activist, but by fighting the extreme pollution, the extraction, the looting and corruption associated with Shell and the other companies in Ogoniland. And he won, although they executed him in 1995. And nonviolent activists have picked up. Of course, another great nonviolent activist, Naomi Klein, with her This Changes Everything. I'd like to recall her Blockadia concept. And then, although there's no time for this, and it's really not appropriate because he's so critical, a brand new book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Okay, he's not into civil disobedience in the old-fashioned style. He's, you know, taking that on with a Verso book just published that is worth watching. I can't spend too much time going into it. I do want to remind us that all across the world, the social movements, the civil disobedience, the protests, even under 2020 lockdown conditions, and we've just been seeing the greatest protest in world history, haven't we, in India for the return to food sovereignty and the rights of farmers against a neoliberal corporate agenda. And I found it interesting that last April, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as Naomi Klein puts it, you know, that's a classic think tank, isn't it? It's a place where people are paid to think by the people who control the tanks, right? That's the US neocon kind of center. But they were worried enough to identify the age of mass protest that was bubbling up all over the world in all sorts of, you know, regions, starting really 10 years ago last month in Tunisia and moving to Egypt and, you know, swinging through with the Occupy movement and all of the struggles in places like Spain and Turkey and Brazil. And, you know, we could go on through this wonderful series of uprisings over that decade to specifically remind where some of the highlighting, especially from those of you in the younger generation, that's been so critical that the youth are saying, really expressing generational rage and saying we have rights as future generations, right? Sunrise Movement in the US doing civil disobedience, sitting in Nancy Pelosi's office. But of course, all credit to the way you can shut down that big city down there in London by just, you know, blocking the bridges with civil disobedience. Lots of arrests, the police beginning to say this is eco-terrorism. You know, I'm glad you had enough strength in Britain to fight back there. I happen to be at this event. This is in Enda Galenda meeting, the Fridays for Future Youth Movement in June 2019 in the coal fields near Köln, the main sort of Ruhr Valley city, and in occupying some of those spaces. Again, Enda Galenda showing repeatedly the ability to pull 8, 10, 15,000 people out under harsh conditions where those German police know what to do. It's just the beginning. Today is coal, tomorrow is capitalism, which brings us to some of the bigger picture questions. I do want to locate my own bias. Sitting in Cape Town, we ran out of water 3 years ago. It was what we call day zero. We didn't quite run out, but very close. Many of the cities and towns in the Eastern Cape have run out. And then we've also had floods. This one, the rain bomb in Easter of 2019, killed 71 people, mostly women and children and all of them Black people, African people in these very badly built state houses and near the rivers. And indeed in 2019, across Southern Africa, we had the sites of vulnerability like Cyclone Idai, Cyclone Kenneth. And then this year, it's been the locust plague. So a lot of what motivates, I think, Shobhan and Nathan, you'll agree, people of conscience is indeed identifying the victims. James put it very well. This ongoing locust plague is just devastating the Horn of Africa, for example. So if we go to these principles, strategies, tactics, and alliances, and find these books of use, quickly recall how giving up on these elites, the way Greta Thunberg really is about to, and I'll just give you a quick, at the end, a quick set of rationales for giving up on global elite politics. What is happening in civil disobedience at the base? We have a roving transnational conflict zone, mostly anti-extractivist. In fact, Anglo-American Corporation, that used to be here in South Africa, now in London, but it was the biggest company traditionally in Africa, identified $24 billion of projects that had been, in a sense, subject to Blockadia 5 years ago. I think they're growing and growing. What unites them is that the extractive industries, especially fossil fuels, are just going anywhere and everywhere as fast as they can. But here's the civil disobedience: is people at the forefront are really beginning to unite, and they're making demands that are democratic in character: control over resources, the health of their water, air, and soil. Indeed, you can't deny the failures of top-down environmentalism. So as Naomi puts it, this is more than a change in strategy, it's a change in perspective, a collective response. It's changing from something that primarily takes place behind closed doors and lobbying, and now is in the streets, unpredictable. It's in the farmers' fields and forests. Scott Parkin from Rainforest Action Network sums it up. People are hungry for climate action that doesn't just ask you to be a clicktivist sending emails to your climate denying congressperson or updating your Facebook status. So here's where I feel we have a great census of this. If you haven't seen this website, the EJ Atlas, I worked on that a bit with Joan Martinez Ale and all of the activists and scholars in Barcelona. And you can find in the EJ Atlas a great many of the Blockade sites in great detail, right? You can really hone in all of these different categories. You can do all manner of filters on these and identify, okay, this is where Blockade is happening. Each has a different story. Let me just give you a couple of the stories, because the Niger Delta, as Nimo Bassi puts it, into Kuka continent, is a critical site amongst all of these resource-rich and hence resource-cursed, if you want to use that phrase that's slightly problematic, but the phrase really works in the Niger Delta, where Ken Saro-Wiwa ultimately failed with nonviolence and was replaced, in a sense, through the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta. And one of the members is Dr. Temitope Oriola. That's his Cambridge University Press book, his PhD. And it's a terrific book about what it was to be inside MEND as a militant fighting to block oil extraction. At one point in 2007, before there was an amnesty and a sort of bribe to stop the struggle, they actually had locked down 80% of the oil in the Niger Delta and the creeks from Ogoniland all the way through. Absolutely stunning success. And the techniques, the tactics were a little bit beyond civil disobedience. That had been tried. So they were into kidnapping the foreign oil workers. They often gave them Stockholm Syndrome by persuading them of their righteousness of their cause. Another case, just very recent, very hard sore for many of us who knew Fikile Nchingazi, who was fighting coal extraction in a place next to the oldest game park in Africa. It's called Shoshlu Mfolozi. You can see it on the left, and it's in northern KwaZulu-Natal, a couple of hours north of Durban, host of the 2011 Climate Summit. And there's this huge coal mine at the Somkele village, and the activists, and mostly women, because the men have often found ways to work in those coal mines, or often are actually in other cities because of the migrant labor system that persists. And these women are regularly out blocking, and that was why, not just because of their physical blocking of the coal trucks, where they would sit in front of them to prevent them from departing because of the enormous damage to their own lives, but they had a climate critique as well. But also they took legal steps, and that was why I think ultimately the pro-mining forces assassinated Fikile last October. In Durban, there have been big protests on the Global Day of Action against the the climate summit, the UN, and we really took this seriously, and I hope you all do. If you don't, please come back with counter arguments that this kind of process, as Bill McKibben put it, that when you get Jacob Zuma, Lula da Silva, Obama, Wen Jiabao, Manmohan Singh sitting together in a secret room in Copenhagen, unambitious, non-binding, no penalty for default or withdrawal, as Donald Trump then proved. This is the League of Super Polluters that blew up the UN. And we had as well activists on the ground, the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance breaking down using civil disobedience to condemn climate colonialism, climate genocide, and a terrific negotiator, Lumumba Diaping in Copenhagen, who said, basically, we've been asked to sign a suicide pact, right? This is worse than no deal. What is Barack Obama going to tell his daughters about their Kenyan relatives' lives, that they're not worth anything? So he was head of G77, the big third world group, and he was an undiplomatic diplomat. And exactly, it's that spirit of telling it like it is, really explaining why the current structure of multilateralism is really so much pressure from the fossil fuel industry, the big high carbon industries, that we're not going to find much in these big summits. We hosted one in Johannesburg in 2002, the Rio Plus 10, and again, nothing, no progress. What about Paris? Very quickly, extreme climate injustice, even though there's people celebrating it, and I'll end with that idea. That is not a good idea to legitimize, and I hope James is with me on this, because the global emissions reduction requirements, fairly distributed, were just not there. 3 degrees came from those national determined contributions. The accountability mechanisms, the penalties, were not there. There was no real attempt to do carbon taxation properly and to dispense with the failed carbon trading. The whole idea I mentioned as polluter pays, the reparations due to the victims of climate change, you know, whether in Ward 9 of New Orleans or much of Africa, much of the South, the loss and damage that the activists are claiming are it's just ignored. It was written out. You can't even raise liability or compensate for the unused carbon space. The just transition isn't there. The intellectual property restrictions on climate-friendly technology remain. They didn't do anything to incorporate military, maritime, and air transport emissions. And fossil fuel owners were not told to cease new exploration or to revalue the unburnable carbon. As James Hansen, the greatest climate scientist, put it, it's a fraud, really, a fake. It's bullshit, right? And this was proven over the subsequent years as this climate fund in Korea, which was meant to do the adaptation and resilience support for poor countries, was the subject of a default, not just from the US, but just unacceptable. And this is why what happened a couple of weeks ago is so frustrating, right? Because net zero is the new framing from the global establishment. Kerry was the Secretary of State with a guy called Todd Stern as the main manager of that UNFCCC in Paris. They didn't do anything. They're not talking about changing any of those fatal flaws. Instead, the US will exercise leadership, especially alignment of financial flows. And that's why Greta Thunberg, speaking about the accounting gimmicks, speaking about these kinds of carbon trading gimmicks where you get an Al Gore claiming the EU emissions trading scheme is working effectively. And that was why he was able to kind of get the US to pretend they were going to sign on to Kyoto because of a promise that if you give us carbon trading, then the US can join. And of course, they never could. They never got the votes. So what do we do? I think the Indigenous Environmental Network said it right by saying we reject market-based solutions and unproven technologies and approaches that don't cut emissions at source. As Food and Water Watch goes on as their critique of the Biden-Kerry project, they really are insistent on stopping all drilling and fracking, which, as you might have heard, the Energy Secretary in the US has just said, no, we're going to continue fracking. Just the last point or two, it's that there is very little serious commitment by national elites to Paris. Only 7 countries came in at the deadline at the end of last year to say we'll have a stronger set of the national determined contributions to make the cuts. 7, right? The 119 didn't even show up and the rest were all inadequate. In South Africa, we've been trying to get some of this put together as well as the just transition to make sure labor, community, and environment are put together with all sorts of strategies to make the shifts desperately needed. A climate justice coalition with the second biggest trade Union Federation, and a wonderful book for free download. I'll leave that out for a moment. I mean, I've actually done a few books, and if you email me at this email, I'll be happy to send them over. But, you know, keep an eye on this country as one of the sites with a climate justice charter, where in the first stage of trying to win hearts and minds, quite radical and yet well-reasoned arguments are being put forward. And then we go to civil disobedience. And in that sense, we'll follow your lead. As I say, the strategies of civil disobedience in Blockadia can be very violent, right? We saw that in the Marikana massacre and in all manner of sites of anti-extractivist struggles. But if we can make this a global movement where the solidarity deepens because of discussions like this, then I'll have much more ambition and optimism. So thanks, Shaban, for bringing me in.
Thank you, Patrick. Some sobering analysis, but definitely tells the real story, or real picture very well. So I'll move on to questions. So the first question is, one of the key challenges with civil disobedience is of causing sufficient disruption whilst keeping the general population on side. And how do we get this balance right? How does the climate movement get this balance right, particularly given the climate movement lacks the overt images of oppression from the villains to the victims that, James, to borrow your phrase, that past social movements had, and the fact that climate movement is often perceived as a privileged middle class issue almost. So how do you get that balance right? What level of disruption is appropriate? James, over to you first.
Okay, yeah. It's a key question, obviously. I talk about what I call the naughty or nice dilemma for strategies, social movements, protest strategies. And you get more attention, the more disruptive you are. You get media coverage. It's doing highly disruptive things. It's good for spreading your message, for making people more aware. The cost of that is that people don't like being disrupted. Governments and police do not like disruptive activities. And so you're going to face more disapproval, more police repression, surveillance, and so on by doing those things. So I think the trick is to try to find either policies or votes or decisions that can be done quickly and that are fairly irreversible. So that if it's a case of union organizing, you try to get that union recognition, because the disruption, you're sort of holding the powers that be hostage. And while you have them hostage and they desperately want to get back to business as normal, they will make concessions. And so you have to make sure that those concessions are then hard to reverse later on, because that's, of course, what they will try to do. So revolutions, I guess, are the paradigm example, right? Once you've had a revolution, once you've destroyed the old regime, it's not coming back in quite the same form, at least. So it's an irreversible, quick change. I'm not sure exactly on climate change what the right example would be, but presumably there could be disruptions that would get you legislative decisions, executive orders fairly quickly.
Well, and sometimes they can come top down. James is right on the way the movements have to conceptualize building up the pressure points. But to me, it also strikes me that, we do have in climate action insiders, right? And we have climate justice typically as outsiders. I always like the way Jesse Jackson framed it as tree shakers outside, shaking the trees, and jam makers inside, who, if the proper degree of shaking of the tree has occurred and there's plenty of ripe fruit, then you've got a wonderful jam. And that division of labor is rarely achieved. And it's partly because I think there's a tendency, very justifiably, to call out climate action for strategies that are rapid in ambition, which we all need, but that are, let's call them false solutions. That's the phrase often used by climate justice for, let's say, one of the trendy examples is and I'm going to ask my dear colleagues at Oxford to confirm or deny, things like bionic plants or carbon capture and storage strategies that will sequester quickly all of this excess carbon. So I do think actually those are the discussions that should be had. I like to compare this between, it's a dialectical relationship between these insiders and outsiders. The insiders turn to what in the academic scene we call ecological modernization. And those are usually technical and market-based strategies. Some of them are, especially in the financial world, the one we're in, which is full of casino, speculative, fictitious capital, such as, all kinds of green bonds and carbon, trades and all the rest of it. Very useless. In fact, they do more harm than good because they often lead to displacement and often have racial and ethnic power. But then on the outside, the just transition activists who are saying, no, shut it all down. They've got one very good classic example of where this has worked, which is the Montreal Protocol, where the insiders actually did something useful in 1987. Some of you may know the Montreal Protocol as a sort of model for what we want global governance ultimately to do when we can change the balance of forces, which is to not put a cap and trade, but to put a cut, and just stop chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, which were coming up out of old refrigerators or your old underarm deodorants, and just stop them, stop making them. So for Dow or for General Electric, they had to be on board. And then even Ronald Reagan, if you can imagine, had to agree, okay, we will ban these. And then actually the ozone hole, which was the whole point of trying to stop CFCs, has actually begun to recover. And it's that precedent where the insiders did do something. I mean, they were under a certain kind of pressure, which was the existential threat of the ozone hole widening out, and with ultraviolet rays making it very difficult for especially people of my complexion. And I think those are the nice moments where you can really say, yeah, there is a precedent. You insiders should do it again. Everyone's worried now whether a great reset from the World Economic Forum, whether that's why when Greta Thunberg was in Davos last month, it was just so good that she wasn't sucked into the accounting gimmicks and all of the other fancy promises. She was really insisting on the cuts and the delegitimization of the world's 1%, the Davos man, the great reset. Although I know there's a sort of whole far right paleocon critique of this, it is great to me that we're not in climate activism and climate scholarship, we're not kind of falling for this yet. So I don't think we have the right, to sum up, the right balance between tree shakers and jam makers. But I'd love to hear where some of you think that is happening. Maybe it's behind the scenes, or maybe when XR tries a strategy of declaring a climate emergency and gets some parliamentarians, yeah, this is going to happen. Well, what good is that? It's just talk, isn't it? So it's really identifying in these iterative processes what's real and what's a false solution.
Well, that's fascinating. Thanks, James. Do you have anything to add on that? Okay, perfect. Thanks very much. That was really insightful. I guess this is kind of follows from that. This kind of pressure you're on about, that the more the outsiders can kind of add, but the radical flank effect is kind of is used to describe when the more radical elements of a movement or the activists have either a positive or negative effect on the more moderate activists for the same cause. And this has been a rationale for taking more radical action, but it also has been shown to have negative effects. Do you think that the climate movement has benefited from this and would benefit from the radical flank effect, or is it again, does it very much depend on how it's done, or do you in general think that there's more positive through this than the negative? Patrick, I'll start with you this time.
Sorry, yes, I do absolutely think you've phrased it. My attempt to, in a way, prefigure your question by identifying the two ideologies that work: ecological modernization and climate justice. Now, I mean, in my own fantasies, there would be some dialectical resolution of those tensions. We'd find a way to plan our way up, Montreal protocols, pressure points, and we'd have an eco-socialist arrangement of sort of organizing society far differently. But that's for another seminar. And then what I said was the way that these ideologies often appear to us as climate justice activists, and especially those will be the indigenous leadership in all of these communities around the world. Winning the XL pipeline shutdown a couple of weeks ago from Biden was great, and that speaks to how that Keystone XL pipeline civil disobedience at the White House during Obama's years, right, was part of a pressure point that Joe Biden remembered. However, they left out the Dakota Access Pipeline and a few others, and I think that's going to be a return to the scenes of struggle in a warm spring, and it's going to be very interesting to see whether these climate insiders are actually going to be serious about the whole gamut of those struggles. The other angle that we just have to address when we're thinking of insider and outsider is racial justice. And again, I'd say, XR has made its mistakes on this, and in South Africa we have lots of histories of white conservation screwing up dramatically and oppressing Black people. But I do think there's something quite extraordinary where BLM in the US, with all its great civil disobedience, has put a series of demands and philosophies out, one of which is reparations. So reparations from slavery is the start of a discussion about reparations for the climate chaos. Once you go there, here is the challenge to those of you who might be more moderate, trying insider ecological modernization. I think the internal contradiction, especially as I mentioned with Todd Stern, since he was such a climate debt denialist, is that the North is still not ready to accept the responsibility. In the New Yorker in late December, Bill McKibben really wrote eloquently about that. It really is time for the North to say, yeah, Black Lives Matter everywhere, especially as I showed you in the continent that's done the least damage in terms of CO2 emissions, but is taking some of the worst hits, this one. And I think that'll be one of the great strategies for our CJ activists, is to find, where racial justice is integral to making this a more powerful movement. The BLM activists made such extraordinary gains at local level, even during the Trump era. And I think we have a lot to learn from, how they could get out on the streets, keep safe protests during the COVID lockdown, and win that moral high ground for quite a long time.
James?
So I think there's a tendency when we're talking about, let's call them the radicals and the moderates of a movement, to think that ultimately they should find some consensus, or that they should work together in a way, coordinate their actions. It's possible, but I see a lot of advantages in having them as quite distinct, not just two groups, but many groups, in fact, in a movement. And when it comes to the radicals versus moderates, what you generally want to avoid is having opponents come along and paint the entire movement in the colors of the radicals, of the most extreme people, or the most, sort of crazy sounding people they can find. So I think it's actually often very useful for the moderates to distance themselves, to actually be critical of more extreme groups in their own movement, so that they can say, well, no, that's not us. We are here asking for these concessions in these arenas, and if they want to go out and blow up pipelines, that's that's not us. So there's also a kind of issue of responsibility, which is the moderates who are inside the tent making the jam can always say, look, we don't have any control over those people sabotaging pipelines. The only thing that's going to help is if we can't control them. The only thing that's going to help is if you make some concessions and you do something for the environment. And so I think having distance, having disagreements in a movement is not only healthy in a creative way for a movement to try different tactics and different ideas, but it also can be strategically useful. You don't need everybody to agree in order to have a strong movement.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So maybe I'll move on a bit to the specifics of with civil disobedience, where it requires some or involves some laws being broken. What laws is it acceptable to break? Is there a line, or is this yeah, for the climate movement? And does this depend on the situation or the context, or are there some laws that you can just never break? In your opinions on civil disobedience, James, I'll start with you.
Okay, sure. Well, I think it differs a lot, culture to culture, country to country. In the United States, there tends to be in the media and among politicians a tendency to lump together property destruction and violence against people. I see those as extremely different things, and I think most activists, on the radical extreme of things, would make that very sharp distinction. But again, in the US, they tend to get mixed together in ways I think they don't get mixed together quite so much in the UK and in Europe. So that would be one distinction. I think very few people would be happy with the targeting of humans and violence against people as a tactic. But violence against things has obvious, immediate economic costs to the owners of those things, of those pipelines and whatever. If you want to blow up a pipeline or put spikes in trees in California, that will get, it'll get a certain kind of attention. It will get the attention of the corporations whom it's costing. It may not get media attention because a lot of sabotage, in fact, corporations want to keep quiet about, right? They don't want to spread the notion that people are spiking trees in the forests where they're cutting, right? This sort of goes back to old, what have been called weapons of the weak that slaves and peasants used, and they would do these things sort of on the sly, and they often got away with it, A, because it was anonymous, but B, the landowners did not want to broadcast that this was going on. They did not want to make this into some sort of social problem because the tactic would then just spread. So you can do a lot of things quietly that way, but of course, in terms of PR, they really are direct action. You stop logging in a place for a while. They're not good for PR because they are not broadcast and complained about by the powers and the owners and so on. So, so that, to me, that would be the main distinction to make.
And Shobha, it's just like you said, it is contingent. I mean, it is going to be context specific. If I were in Boston in 1776, correct me if I'm wrong on my dates, and I would be throwing tea into that harbor for the big tea party. That was a clear case of property destruction as part of the anti-colonial struggle of the US, the young elites of the US. Or if, for Satyagraha in Durban, South Africa, where it was sort of strategized, it took initial form in November 1913 as a march across a provincial line where Indians weren't allowed to go. It was a mass march of Indians. Now, Gandhi's taken some bad rap, including in Andreas Malm's book, very justifiably so, for his ethnicism in his South African years. But the Satyagraha, that truth force, that sense that, yeah, we are righteous and we have the commitment not to humiliate our enemy, but to persuade them just by the very force of our action. That, to me, will help to determine, whether you're going to violate a law, especially a ridiculous set of laws like existed in this country in 1913. And then it seems to me you've got a series of, really big, broad problems of alliance building. And it's not just to have a good PR and an image, but if your tactics are going to alienate a critical potential ally, and usually it's radical young environmentalists against labor, or sometimes it's radical environmentalists being insensitive about race, ethnicity, indigenous space. These are obviously long-standing problems. But I do want to put to the House that it's a great opportunity for us to think, building back better after COVID-19, how labor suffering so much. I don't know any labor movement that's held up strong in spite of this big wave of protests that's continued in late 2020. maybe the Indian labor movement is, you know, farm workers and so forth. But mostly, they would love, I think, to figure out whether environmentalists do have a just transition away out of the carbon-intensive economies, including in some of those sites of struggles, the pipelines, the extractive industries. We haven't done very well in this country, but there is at least a few glimmers of hope where in the metal workers sector, there's some very good rhetoric from the largest union in the country about an eco-socialist outcome that would move this huge coal-fired electricity system to renewables if it were worker self-managed and community controlled and massively subsidized to cross-subsidize and make finally the electricity affordable. Or in current debates against you know, extractive industries where can not just workers but in the women in their social reproduction who are in the communities suffering enormously from the terrible conditions in mines find some common ground. And I hope that'll be, you know, in the US, they have some pretty good work in this area through the trade unions for energy democracy. And I think they've spread out to more than 50 countries of finding advanced guards of progressive trade unionists ready to make this switch. If you can get your trade unionists and your communities, well, you might not need the mass public opinion if that's the kind of core alliance of red and green, as we put it. I think they call it blue and green in the US because they don't really like red for obvious reasons. But it's a very interesting dilemma to try to get everybody to think through how do we make our demands, just like Naomi Klein says, as big as they must be. This changes everything. So if you're struggling for public transport, decommodified, then you're a climate activist, right? If you're struggling for better food sovereignty, well, you're a climate activist against you know, the high carbon fertilizers. If you're trying to get your cities to be more compact, you're a climate activist. If you're working on zero waste, then you know there'd be less emissions from the landfills. You're a climate activist. I think that's going to be the dot connection that we've been missing. Dot connections across race, indigenous, environmental, labor, all of those divisions that have kept this movement far too weak compared to the challenge we have.
Thank you very much.
If I can jump back in, I think that's a great vision. I think there are problems of collective identity in this movement, as in many movements, and it's not just that you have a kind of what we in the US call culture wars issue between environmentalists and labor very often, but there also are, within any movement, there are different tastes and tactics. And because it's at the level of identity or taste, I think these kinds of disagreements are very hard to resolve because they're very hard to talk about, to recognize. So, for example, in the US, a lot of good leftist activists are very ill at ease talking about social class. They're very adept talking about LGBTQ issues, gender issues, pretty good on race. But when it comes to class differences, and especially class tastes, you know, in humor, in who speaks, in deference to leaders, there are a lot of class issues that really lead to different tastes and tactics that, because people don't talk about them, it's very, very hard to resolve them. And I think a lot of the environmental movement has had this issue in trying to make alliances with others. And you know, even within itself, the jam makers and the tree shakers often have very different tastes and are suspicious of each other, and that's hard to overcome, but it's crucial for
we have in the 1930s, you know, popular fronts that actually solved that culture war, that dilemma, and where economistic trade unions, maybe because there were two socialist parties and a communist party, could spread out and think about life as a worker as life in the community, or life as a woman worker, or having, you know, a socio-cultural project, not just the next wage bill. So maybe we go back to the 30s for a few good lessons in these very difficult places like the US.
Thank you both. That was really interesting. I'll move on to the audience questions now. Just we've got a few in. So someone saying disruption is clearly necessary and effective, but seems a very good way to alienate those with the most power to legislate change or permanent change. How do you propose individuals organize? And two, reject the elites without ultimately creating some sort of climate coup, unless this is desired, especially when there are some policymakers who are working to do more, I guess, on side. Patrick, do you want to start?
Sorry, now I'm with you. Yeah, sure. The great question, which I took up in an article in Counterpunch a few days ago, about a week ago, was whether we can expect in a Biden-Kerry elite formulation the possibility of moving forward on not just some of the domestic, obviously extremely powerful impact of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the negotiations that happened last August that brought Biden to this place where he's far, far ahead of any prior U.S. or I think any leader. However, it's that international where I can continue to stress we should be testing. And maybe I would throw it back to you, Shaban, because you're thinking about Glasgow, right? And it's not 100% sure it'll be in November this year. It might be postponed because of the next waves. I think from South Africa, we have some variants, you have some variants, and we may not get a handle on them. So if it is postponed, I hope we do think, and I know there's lots of wonderful people in Britain, for example, at Global Justice Now, thinking about that very question. Is there anyone on the inside? Is there anyone in the inside at Scotland? Because I ran into some of the Scottish elites at the Glasgow Climate Justice Forum in the middle of 2019, including Nicola Sturgeon, who were extremely impressive, right? They were even acknowledging climate debt and hoping that if a re-entry to the EU after a Scottish referendum might work, then it's going to be a very different ballgame. So I think each of these elites needs to be, let's say, very carefully assessed as to what they are doing at any given point in time. And I would worry most about, this kind of Davos narcissism, the Great Reset, and specifically look at net zero as their new catchphrase for what they're trying to do, and then dig in and ask, hey, is this really going to happen, or is this more fibs, more false solutions? Is the Dr. Strangelove kind of formulation that we're going to have to start worrying about? And I hope the people at Oxford are going to be amongst the leaders, because you have a lot of credibility since so many of these false solutions are coming out of your own shop there. So.
That's true. James?
Yeah, so I think when you think of a lot of social movements that have had an impact, I think they're very often successful because they are promoting or accelerating trends that are happening otherwise for other reasons. So, as I mentioned before, if you want to lower fertility rates, well, that's a pretty easy thing to do because fertility rates are falling anyway. You can you can decrease them a little faster. So, like with nuclear energy, there is, at least in the US and a couple other countries, there were large anti-nuclear movements. They won when in the countries where they were successful, largely because the cost of nuclear energy was so high and rising. So I think, a good strategy, a good approach for the climate change movement is to think about, to focus on corporations, to focus on costs, to look for trends. In other words, to be, not just to sit back like we're doing today and speculate, but to look for opportunities. So Zoom is an opportunity for for decreasing travel around the world for a lot of, the talking classes. There are others like, the energy costs are always changing, and they're changing slowly in a way that is good for the climate, I think, for the most part. That can be accelerated. So consumer boycotts, I think, are a very powerful tool. It's the problem with boycotts is it's just hard to get enough people to do them. Boycotts, I've written about boycotts to some in the past. And boycotts usually work because of the bad publicity that corporations don't like, because one group after another has a press conference saying it's joining this boycott or that boycott. And boycotts don't usually work because demand really is cut for a product. They're worried that it will be. They're panicked in a way. Just the kind of effect that you want from civil disobedience. You want to panic those elites. You want corporate leaders to think, oh my God, what's going to happen to our reputation? What's going to happen to our consumers if this catches on? Well, it doesn't really need to catch on to get action from corporate decision makers. So, I think if you look for places where history is otherwise already on your side, then it makes some of these what would otherwise be very aggressive actions a little more palatable and a little more effective.
Well, could I come in? Because I think on that, James, I'm very respectful of all that work on, the nuclear anti-nuke, especially nuclear plants, nuclear weapons, and very good groups, did a lot of CD in Agreement Commons, Greenpeace, fantastic histories of doing strategic civil disobedience. Just yesterday, I think there was a bit of this attempt to do the labor and environmental alliance in Paris. I don't know yet how it all turned out, but maybe people in the chat room can help us, against Total, right? Or a week before, disruptive activity in Amsterdam. And these were nonviolent protests, and they're partly about, again, finding those sites of coalitions. But it does strike me that these are one of the, these are the great moments to put the kind of coalitions together. And in that sense, militant tactics are going to be worked through. And last little quick word, for boycotts for sanctions calls, let's say the most immediate for us would be in the climate movement, the disinvestment, divest and reinvest from fossil fuels into renewables. But that's had an extraordinary effect on drying up sort of development finance and making it very difficult, even in a very coal-addicted place like South Africa, to continue on this trajectory. South Africa was maybe the finest site of sanctions because the activists here called for them. And it hurt the activists because the economy was suffering in the mid-1980s. But it was a kind of strategic decision to say, let's split the whites, the white business here, the white racist government there, and try and, they're always together. Let's see if we can split them with sanctions. Similarly for the Israeli occupation of Palestine, BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, have been, I think, very powerful. It's so powerful, it's kind of, disreputable in some circuits to even talk about BDS. And I think that's been a very good reflection of just how hard that has been hitting. And it's back to the starting point, isn't it, Siobhan, which is the legitimation or delegitimization of these targets, sanctions, boycotts, to go along with micro civil disobedience. It's got to be part and parcel of the whole repertoire.
If I can just respond for a second about the anti-apartheid movement, I think that's a very good example and a model. Now, you would know better than I'm sure. My recollection is that a key part of divestment was putting pressure on banks, and that it was partly shaming banks, but then partly also it was the civil violence going on within South Africa that made banks think, oh my God, this is not the future we are going to make money from, in a way, so that it was both political pressure, civil disobedience, but also real pretty nasty, violent protests that made the banks, the Western banks in the end, throw up their hands. And as we know, we live in a world of finance capital. If you get the banks against you, your history. And so you need to target these things carefully that way.
And indeed, I think I'll just mention, because I knew my boss at the time in the early mid-80s, Paul Volcker, had put the interest rate up so high, James, that the last factor you didn't say, but is probably most critical, is that the gold price collapsed, and therefore apartheid's a little sort of social surplus that it could draw out and build the barriers effectively had gone, and then there was a big default in 1985. Yeah, those are all definitely factors, and where community activists, where I've certainly worked when I was doing my PhD in Baltimore, they were doing community anti-redlining against the banks, African-American neighborhoods that were just, absolutely either predatory financing or redlining, and that's some combination of bankster malevolence on the one hand, but greenlining the Pretoria regime. And I suspect we'll find in, the ecological modernizationists' own portfolios, I'm thinking of Bill Gates, plenty of oil shares, all that kind of stuff that will help to, again, make the links between those who are really committed still to profitability in a capitalist fossil and high carbon sector, and they will be the ones to fight. And I think that's going to be a good signal that the people who've been doing divest, invest, more power to you. Keep it going.
That was a fascinating discussion. Thanks, thank you both. There's been a few questions coming in about the global South. So a lot of these strategies we've been talking about in civil disobedience there's a lot more risk involved in some countries in the global South, or just countries where there is less political opportunity space. For example, where there's censorship, fear of human rights violations due to mobilizing. So how can people there organize? What does civil disobedience in these places look like? Or is it appropriate in these places? What are your thoughts on that?
And do you have others? Yeah, we're taking long.
Sure. Yeah, and then another one which is very similar line, is just should masses of protesters be arrested, as Roger Hallam advocates in the global North, and what is the relevance of this strategy in the global South of civil disobedience?
Okay, well, I mean, if James, you allow me, because you're in Florida, which is a ghastly site where there's lots of global South, and I'm in the most unequal city. Johannesburg is the most, and Cape Town's the fifth, but this is the most unequal country, and I'm clearly in the global North with my nice view of the Atlantic. So I'm not going to say that the global South is going to, make a very, very clear statement on where, I can't do that, on where the commitment level is to disrupt the system. But I can certainly tell you that the ejatlas.org is where you want to look to see the very high costs. So hundreds of great environmentalists are murdered by their local opponents. And one of the critical things that sometimes will prevent that, or if it has happened, make it impossible for the local sources of pollution, of extraction of fossil fuels to do it again, is international solidarity. And that's again where calls for sanctions and calls for boycotts, but even just identifying the international financial relations in which you have your own pension fund. I know mine is very implicated in all kinds of companies that need to be nailed. And I think making much more public these relationships, disalienating the sort of flows of capital. So you in the City of London know, for example, that many of the biggest mining houses on the London Stock Exchange do terrible damage. And I'll finish with one great example, because it led in 2018, I think it was 2019, to one of the biggest mining houses, which is originally from India, called Vedanta, having to actually delist from the London Stock Exchange because in Zambia, villagers that were the victims of the Konkola copper mine, the largest copper mine in Africa, massive poisoning of their streams, massive extraction of wealth, illicit financial flows. The man running it, Anil Agarwal, was absolutely notorious. And it was because of Mining Watch, a small group of sort of sophisticated activists who could regularly put out a few dozen people into the streets at the annual general meetings, finding solidarity between the global North and global South. And I'll mention that the way to do that, I think, if you're intellectually interested in studying these global value chains, suddenly you realize that there's uncompensated, non-renewable resource depletion from all over the global South. There are even measurements of this. They're called natural capital accounts. The World Bank has a changing wealth of nations database that's quite useful to identify why the extractive process from the global South makes the global North richer. That's just the unequal ecological exchange. And I desperately would love the folks on the call here to pick that up as one of your own challenges, because once you do the tracking back of where those uncompensated, non-renewable, depleted sources of Africa's wealth are coming from, I promise you, you will see conflicts on the ground, and those conflicts you must join.
That's really inspiring. Thank you, Patrick. James?
Yeah, I wouldn't presume to set priorities for people anywhere else in the world, or certainly not in the global South. I think we can provide, part of the huge inequality in the world is we can provide resources to people in less developed countries that for us are not huge amounts of money, but are a lot for them to help them with their projects. I think the trick is making sure we don't distort their projects, right? We put out a request for proposals, or we're going to fund insurgents or somewhere. We don't want them to change too much what they're doing just because there's money involved or available. Clifford Bob has written a very nice book called The Marketing of Rebellion on how there's a kind of almost market relationship between rich Western funders and, you know, the best funders in some ways among us, and local insurgents, Ken Saro-Wiwa being one of the cases. The Agoni is a group that he looks at, and how they did change. They became more environmentalist, for example, because that was popular with Amnesty International or whoever it was. They also, I should add, he finds Shell Oil was a very good target for them. There you have a fat oil company based in the Netherlands with a global reach. It could be portrayed as quite sinister. It could also be targeted in a way that it could be shamed into improving its practices. As Patrick will be quick to say, that didn't really work entirely well, but the idea is that there are international corporations that can be targeted, that have a reach throughout the world, and they are especially amenable to northern influence, even though their impacts are often in the global South. So that's something to consider when you're thinking about targets.
Thank you. We've just had a couple of questions similar vein. Someone's asked, they worry that a lot of the actions in XR, and I guess this applies to many civil disobedience kind of movements, end up mainly affecting working class road users, effectively helping to incubate another yellow vest reaction. So what would be better targets for protests? And I guess this follows from what you've just kind of been saying, James. But also someone asked, do you think in general getting arrested is a useful tactic for pressing for change or raising awareness, or is it not? James, would you like to start?
I think it is. And movement after movement has had a lot of success getting people arrested. Some of it depends on the numbers, but it's almost always true that the more people you have willing to be arrested through civil disobedience, the better. It also helps who they are. Having celebrity, always having celebrities involved gets more attention, and the media attention is useful, and it's hard to get, especially in a world in which, as Patrick's slide showed, there's more and more protest in the world. It's an everyday form of politics now, so it in a way becomes harder to get attention. So you need even bigger numbers, or you need more dramatic actions, or you need people who themselves as celebrities get attention. So certainly, I think it is a useful tactic. At the same time, police have gotten smarter, right? They know when they should arrest people, whom to arrest. They arrest people the day before, very often, whom they consider the ringleaders, as the strange term is. So they know how to corral people. They know how to move people. They know how to make crowds feel less comfortable. So the protesters are learning things tactically, but the police are learning them as well. You still have police making what turn out to be mistakes in policing by being overly aggressive themselves and being caught on camera and sort of classic shameful instances of violence. So they haven't entirely learned how to stay away from getting filmed doing bad things, but and that's for better or worse, that is one of the things that civil disobedience promises, that you will embarrass the other side somehow. At least the police. The police are not usually your target, although with Black Lives Matter they were the target. But with climate change, they're not the real target. But yes. So civil disobedience works. Getting arrested works, not always, but often enough compared to other tactics. There's no magic formula about what works, but getting arrested, it's a sign of commitment, right? To be arrested, it's more of a commitment than signing an online petition, say. So that gets people's attention.
If I can think back, James, if you'll help me, because you were in New York, I'm sure, during Occupy, Zuccotti Park, but all over the world, the Occupy strategies, which led to mass arrests and led to terrible, police attacks on these encampments. Again, this, for those who don't know, this was against basically the economic injustices that were so prevalent after the 2008-9 bailouts went to the rich and left mass homelessness or student debt in the US way above capacity to pay. And the question I'm asking really, Shoban, comes to your point about road occupations, which is disruptive spaces, right? And so Zuccotti Park wasn't disruptive. It was just a wonderful symbolic site to occupy. However, there are, and I would probably, Shoban, you and your British allies would go back to Reclaim the Streets for some very important lessons from the was that early 2000s that were about, or 90s even, to try to stop highway expansions. This is very critical in most of the global south I know, where I've seen activists use the highway, use the street for blockading as a disruptive tactic, not just to occupy a symbolic space, a center of town, as so many great urban movements have done in the last decade, but to actually go and, like the piqueteros 20 years ago, I think they got rid of 5 Argentine presidents in the course of a couple of weeks by just saying, okay, we will just stop this place. It'll be a kind of a Rosa Luxemburg mass strike, shut it down. And I think that's actually quite extraordinary, where the street blockade or the highway blockade in many sites of struggle in South Africa, not climate, but for basic water, electricity, basic amenities. The activists really have done a good job when they identify what disruptive tactics they can invoke that will get the authorities to say, hey, whatever you're doing, stop it. What do you want? We'll give you a few pennies. We want to, like Saul Alinsky's kind of tactics, just create enough nuisance. And it's there, if you're interested in the South African scene, which is often considered the protest capital and so vibrant with, one of the most militant labor forces in the world, and community protests. We had fees must fall to get free tertiary education a couple of years ago. AIDS medicines are free, and life expectancy has gone from 52 to 65 because of protests. Fantastic legacies. The brand new book by Trevor Ngwani, who's the president of the South African Sociological Association at the University of Johannesburg is his base, and it's called I'm a Committee, and the grassroots democracy in South African shack settlements. And his PhD was very much about working through with the community activists where they felt they needed to be disruptive and what they wanted. And it's a new innovation. If you look at the world as a site of anger and protest bubbling up all over, you can actually see it under a database, a big data collection that Google's part of called GDELT, G-D-E-L-T. And they measure it quite well at the University of Sussex at a project called ACLED, A-C-L-E-D. Don't ask me what they stand for. But these are great, kind of quick scans of real-time protests that are going on. And in South Africa, this is such a nice book from Pluto Press, I'm a Committee. It means the committee in a sort of Zulu slang. And it's a great book to show you the combination of principles, analyses, strategies, tactics, and alliances that really then do get some results, even if they haven't quite got to the point where they can say that we have a national movement. Their local blockadia, in a sense, works well. I think that should translate well to climate activists, to find aspects of disruption, not just violent and non-violent, the classic definitions, but disruptive. That's really where the orientation of the movement has to go if it wants to shake up its enemy with power. Right?
Is it? I guess just following that, is there not the case where the disruption, I don't know, is mainly affecting the working class and is not targeting the people that you want, who are more responsible? So the disruption maybe in that way and turns off people who you're trying to get some support, and I don't know, does it demonize the own movement? Should it be a bit more intelligent than just as significant disruption as possible? I don't know.
Well, predictably, these are disruptions that occur because they're hard to sustain for maybe 4 hours, 8 hours at most. They can bubble up and sustain community anger. But if you mentioned Yellow Vests, which was originally a movement you could call a movement against the carbon tax that was imposed on them in a way that especially rural working class people took a bigger sort of regressive tax hit because they travel longer distances and have more petrol consuming automobiles. And it's there, I think, that I think the same thing happened in Ecuador after a massive tax hike in 2019, or in Nigeria in early 2012, a national protest. And all manner of tactics were used, but I think the tricky thing, and why Yellow Vests sustained themselves, they were saying, no, we're acting in the national interest of the 99% against the 1%, and that means you'll be disrupted if you're driving. We're going to occupy these circles on a Saturday, every Saturday. And they kind of did that effectively, but you could plan ahead if you were a worker and get around it. I do think, though, that that's where our capacities to make ideologically sound, sometimes more connected to political parties than we've seen. If you can find a progressive political party that finds ways to draw in the social movements, and that's the hardest thing. We've just seen very few. Maybe Momentum in Britain has been one of the interesting examples of trying to have a foot in the Labour Party and a foot in the social movements in Britain too. And I'm hoping those are the sort of examples that the next generation of wise radicals, whether they be social democrats or anarchists or socialists or communists, they can work with next generations to show, how badly they failed to find that unity in the past and how critical it is.
Thank you. That's really interesting. James?
I don't really have anything to add.
Sure.
Great point.
No problem. I think I'm just acutely aware I've gone over the time. So I'll just ask for if there's any closing remarks you want to leave our viewers with before I end the live stream. James, would you like to start?
It's been a great discussion. I've really enjoyed it. Those were really good questions. Thank you.
And for me, I love being with you all. And I just think back to my own days protesting against Tesco, on the main road in Oxford because of their importing of apartheid lettuce and fruits and all the rest of it in the late 1980s. And it just does strike me that if in Britain you do figure out more of these relationships between civil disobedience, and you figure out in Glasgow, whenever the COP26 will be held, we will be in solidarity. And I think what I've been seeing, in fact, even today, there were protests at the British Embassy because of Boris Johnson, with Joe Biden, with Jair Bolsonaro, with Brussels, all these bad boys on the climate vaccine apartheid, right? That these governments refuse to open up generic medicines on vaccines. We, I think, around the world would be quite ready to see where those of you in the North, as you see the need to do civil disobedience in Glasgow. And I'll just remind you, I think the one great idea in 2009 that was never tried, but it came from Michael Hart. You might know Hart and Negri and their collection of books about the current conjuncture and activism, like The Multitude. And Michael once said, instead of the blockade that keeps these negotiators out, maybe the next step is to do what, say, Liberian women did when they needed an end to the civil war, and they took off their clothes and they were really militant, to tell the negotiators, you're staying in the building, which is what they did in Ghana, right? And you're not going to come out until you fix this civil war, this terrible conflict in Liberia. And those to me would be strategic, and especially since we're talking tactically, innovative ways that I hope the next COP26 struggle will consider. When we hosted the COP17, the Durban Climate Summit, and I was the kind of host of a people space at the university nearby, we did a very bad job. I wrote an article that was very self-critical in Ephemera. And it was partly because I don't think we confronted climate justice and climate action in a mature way. And we didn't find tree shakers and jam makers in harmony. We were just at each other's throats. And maybe that's the way it will be. But I think I'd look to British activists, often at the cutting edge, to help us along. And if you are needing solidarity in the form of the protest movement around the world, saying, yeah, there's some British embassies, consulates, not far from our city square, our Capitol buildings, we can probably find a few of them, and you'll find some activists if you make that call. Thanks again, Siobhan. Thanks, James, Nathan, and all of you there.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic to end on. So yeah, really appreciate James and Patrick. It's been a fantastic discussion, so thank you.
Just 2 words.
Yep.
If you do find South Africans in your midst in these civil disobedient protests, which you always will, not only can they sing and toy, that's the war dance better, but they have 2 words I just want to leave you with. Mandela, which is power. Away to the people. Mandela, away to.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for that. Okay, so I'll just wrap up this event. So thank you everyone for tuning in today. Just to let you know of our next couple of events we have coming next week. First, we have an event on February 17th at 5 p.m, which will focus on the clean energy transition in India, often overlooked when discussing climate action in favor of its neighbor to the northeast. India is currently running one of the most ambitious renewable energy capacity programs in the world. So join us as we discuss the barriers to sustainable and low carbon development in India with Professor Navroz Dubash from the Centre of Policy Research and Mr. Amitabh Kant, CEO of the National Institute for Transforming India. And the second event, we're pleased to announce actually our first ever multilingual event on extraction education, with an exclusive Indigenous panel of speakers. This event is in collaboration with ISIS magazine in Oxford, and will discuss the ways in which mining companies increasingly own educational institutions for tribal youth, and the effects this has on the anti-mining oppositions and the threats to Indigenous cultural identities. And speakers include Ruby Hembrom, Sunny Sori, and Katie Makoa from India and Ecuador, with languages ranging from English to Hindi to Spanish. And that event is on next Friday, 19th of February at 5 p.m. So thank you everyone for tuning in. And again, thank you Patrick and Jasper for a fascinating discussion. We'll end the live.